Hello, today's lecture is lecture 4 on culture. We defined culture early on in the first lecture as basically consisting of norms, values, material items that are specific and unique to given groups of people that view themselves as united in some fashion and live in a particular area with a particular lifestyle. Uh, to be more specific, the definition from the first lecture was from George Richard's textbook, Introduction to Sociology. And he defined it as the symbols, ideas, values, practices, and material objects that a group of people use to meet basic biological needs and interact with other individuals and groups, the symbolic and learned aspects of human existence. I believe I also mentioned that the sociologist Ann Swidler considers culture really the toolkit. It's all those things that people need to get by in the world, and people that are living in the same general area in the same general way, and who share common, fairly recent ancestors and tend to constitute a culture. A culture itself are these elements, but a culture is the group of people that agree that this is the way things should be done. This is what's important. This is a rule that you must follow. This is a value that cannot be contradicted in practice. So we're going to go into a lot more detail about that. Most people today, we're really inhabiting several cultures at once. There's regional culture specific to Texas, and then there's a global culture. There are things that we enjoy, for instance, for recreation, entertainment, that are coming to us from other parts of the world, from other cultures. There's also consumer culture, the idea that the meaning of life comes from, or the most important thing in life is to have a lot of stuff. That's what the sociologist Leslie Sklar calls the culture ideology of consumption. And he claims that is the primary export from the Western world to the developing world, not things per se, but this embrace of consumption as something to orient your life around, to give your life meaning. So there's also digital cultures. You may be on social media, TikTok, whatever, and interacting with people there. There are subcultures as well we'll talk about. Subcultures are groups that share most of the same values, norms, ways of appearing, for instance, and not all, with the dominant culture in a society. But there's something unique about them that sets them apart, and there are other people who share this unique feature. I'll talk about some examples later. So, backing up again, cultures, the shared beliefs, values, and material objects that members of a group must learn, follow, and use to get by in the physical and social world. We are totally immersed in culture. I mean, you can't really separate yourself from it. I'm not sure some elements, if we would not be ourselves without some of the elements of culture that we've developed. For instance, language, spoken and written. There are animal societies that do not have a spoken or written language that communicate in other ways, but some means of communication is necessary to coordinate social action, to have a society at all. So also it's important to recognize that our cultural understandings, these beliefs about what's right and wrong, what's appropriate and not, what one must wear in certain settings, the type of food that is appropriate and that type of food which is forbidden. These things change over time. They're not generally fixed forever. So culture is sort of society's glue in a way. It's what holds society together. It's not the same thing, but they're closely related. Often, if you hear the term culture, some people use it to refer to art, literature, music, uh, those sorts of aesthetic expressions. That's a different meaning than we're using, but you will sometimes run across that meaning. So it tends to be used more often by an elite group to establish that their art, music, literature is superior to another, or that people who do not put a high value on the aesthetic experience of art, music, literature are somehow less than them, less than in parentheses. So that view of culture, it can be summarized as saying culture is the best that has been thought and said and also performed, painted. The anthropological sense of culture is that everything one must know to be a functioning member of a community, back to the same toolkit, or the entire way of life of the people, including material goods, technology, and attitudes, and language and religion, ideas, all those things. So cultural sociology is a big part of sociology right now. The American Sociological Association has a number of sections for people with specific interests within sociology, specific focus. Uh, Cultural anthropology has more members than any other. Uh, I believe race and ethnic relations has the second highest number of members. There are all kinds of sections of sociology. There's animals and society. If you're concerned about animal welfare, there's a section for you. I belong to the environment, science, and technology section, and a couple of others. It's the ETS that really I pay the most attention to now. I had been part of the world systems theory group, but left that. But anyway, one thing that these elements of culture do, they put a boundary between one group and another, a symbolic boundary, really. It defines the clothing you wear, the hand signals you use, the language you speak, defines your membership in one group and not another. So people can be identified, recognized by other members of that culture by their dress, their language, their accent, their tattoos, piercings, what have you. So it creates a boundary between the in-group, those the people how they their culture, so you know what to expect, what's appropriate and inappropriate in communication and physicality. Draws the boundary between your safe group, so to speak, and others. So sorry, I'm getting my phone keeps buzzing. Okay, so it seems to be somewhat natural for people to draw boundaries in this way. It's not harmful unless it's used in some way to systematically disadvantage people on the other side of that boundary. Originally, we probably started early in our evolutionary history, might have drawn a boundary, or at least a temporary boundary between groups of people we might encounter that we did not know. We did not know their ways, what they might be, what interest they might have in us, and so forth. I've been reading a book called Humankind by a Dutch sociologist, historian named Bretman, and he argues that people have always been nice and friendly to each other and sociable. and that there was no such thing as war, or at least there's no evidence of it, until we had something like civilization and some settled society dependent upon agriculture to provide a surplus, which was appropriated by elites and then used to control everyone else. So, that's one point of view. It's definitely different than the typical historical treatment of early human life. So, okay, as I mentioned, some of these elements that define the draw a boundary. For instance, many street gangs have special hand signals, and they have special sorts of tattoos and so forth that define their group membership. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. I'm going to share this one because I can, hold on. Trying to control the lighting a bit. It's not cooperating. I think. Okay, the usual decorations that I put on title slides. Here we have some members of the Yanomami tribe of, they're in Colombia and Brazil, South America. They are had been very isolated. They weren't known to the civilized world, so to speak, the non-Yanomami world for quite some time. Their view of the universe and how it operates is astonishingly different than most other cultures. And now I'm going to pause it because I must look up the name of a book. Okay, I'm back. I have something better than the title of a book. I have a video that accompanies it. Or I'm not sure, I've never seen the video. So the book is called The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman. A shaman is a religious figure that is believed to have the ability he has some connection with the world beyond this physical world that we see. Often shaman are believed to have and appear to have special abilities to heal people. They know the proper rituals to appeal to the other realm for aid and comfort and guidance. Shamans are found in many different cultures, not simply this one. European, Asian, and those in this hemisphere, as this example. And so going back to share the screen once again. And here we have, the book is called The Falling Sky, Notes of a Yanomami Shaman. It's basically simply a conversation between a shaman who had become somewhat westernized and a French anthropologist. It's a fascinating book. Let's see what this video tells us.
Esse livro é uma mensagem. Da mensagem chegar até no pensamento dos brancos. Nós queremos ensinar o sonho do nosso xamanismo que pensa e sonha de olhar com o pajé. É uma mensagem, para a mensagem chegar até no pensamento dos brancos. Nós queremos ensinar o sonho do nosso xamanismo que pensa e sonha de olhar com o pajé. Botar aqui nessa buraco, botar um pó, né? Um pó. Aí depois soprar com outro pessoa, com outro nariz pessoa. Aí ele vai entrar a universo dos pajés. Ele leva para conhecimento, para entrar no cabeça. Para conhecer o mundo, né? Como o mundo da terra, da água, e céu, trovão, lua, estrela. Então, essa pedaço, ele vai mostrar tudo. Vai mostrar para conhecer, o paciente conhecer o que existe dentro do universo. Tá? O papel pessoal é muito importante para curar uma pessoa, um médico. Nossa cuida de saúde não cuida, muito também. O saberito cuida do seu. Quando o paciente cuidando, nós estamos ficar em paz. Eu espero que a nossa livro vai valer para ensinar a cabeça dos brancos a pensar da nossa história. História que é como original.
Okay. Okay, Yanomami. Now you know a little bit more about them and shamanism. Um, so these, you don't see too many people with these, but if you do, and the face painting on the child, and you were a Yanomami, you would know them as one of your own. Here, there's a distinction. Some people have, often for a long time have made. I mentioned those who view culture as the best that has been thought and said. Tend to be elites who think that those who are interested in things that are not quite as, in their words, the best are not living right, whatever it is. But the concept of high and low culture, you don't see that a lot, but it has a heritage. High culture are things the elites like, the ballet, symphony, abstract art, things of that type. So, whereas popular culture is popular music. Well, low culture. Popular culture is the term that's used now. It's a little more kind than low culture. So popular culture could be television, films, popular music. Here we have chamber quartet. This is the stereotypical high culture as opposed to popular culture. Popular culture is a culture of the people. There are many ways to look at it. We'll get to that later. This photo, I think, was taken down at Central Campus of HCC. This is a hipster, they say, so a subculture of sorts, or really more of a lifestyle. This is an Indian wedding ceremony, I believe, and here we have some more popular culture. I believe that's Lady Gaga. Yes, it is. I think. I don't want to say for sure because I may have changed the photo and forgotten to change the photo credit. That's not a good thing. I get these photos from Wikimedia Commons and they're free for anybody to use, so I can avoid violating copyright laws. So let's move into this. Okay, I just covered this. Some of these elements, values, these things that we use to decide what is good and just in society. Value, for instance, it can be, the value of equality, the value of equal opportunity in these things. These are values, okay? There's, as you probably know, and we've seen a lot of evidence of, these values are in practice in the real world are violated frequently. People act in ways other than these values. And in fact, most anthropologists and sociologists now will say that, values aren't people. It used to be believed that values are how people orient themselves to an action they're going to take when they're making a decision. Should I do this? Does it conflict with our culture's values or not? And that's going to be the basis on which they decide what to do. That is not true. I mean, not just in this culture, but others. There are other, culture is such a broad thing. I mean, you're going to act as members of your culture would generally, but that covers a lot of ground. So norms. This is from the free textbook, so I can quote it directly. Visible and invisible rules of conduct through which societies are structured. Mores, pronounced like the moray eel. Moral views and principles. These are more important norms, typically. Mores can blend into laws, can morph into them. They often are embedded in a legal code and are laws. Folkways is a term, I don't know that it's that useful anymore. It's a little odd. Basically, it just means customs. When you greet someone, do you shake hands? Do you do something else? I mean, this pre-COVID-19 world, of course. What is customary? Some examples. Okay, a value in our culture, health. You should live a healthy life. You shouldn't do things that are bad for you. Norms, rules of conduct. Well, if you've ever flown on Southwest Airlines, you know that on your boarding pass there's a number, and they put some poles with some numeric ordering out for boarding, and you are supposed to go and stand in the slot that matches the number on your boarding pass. That's just kind of a norm. That's a more or less, and it's visible and invisible. They instruct you to do it, but what happens if you don't? What if you have number 50 C41 and you go and get in the wrong boarding group? I think it'd be very unusual for a Southwest employee at the gate to tell you, no, you cannot board. Or particularly if it's your group and you're just jumping ahead number-wise. Other people will notice. They'll tut up about it. Probably nobody's going to, confront anyone doing it. Moray, on the other hand, the moral views and principles that can be embedded in laws. So values, you should stay healthy. Norms, follow these rules. So you've gone through you've stayed in your place. Well, you jumped ahead here. You violated a norm. You're a smoker. You smoke cigarettes, so you've violated this health value already. Mores, which can be laws, also come into play. Let's say you get on the plane and you're very stressed, and before it takes off, well, after it's in the air, it's a bumpy ride. So you go back to the restroom and disable the smoke detector and have a cigarette. You think you won't get caught. Well, you will get caught. Then you've broken a law, and that sets you up for sanctions, fines, punishment of some sort. So that's how these things can kind of nest together in our everyday life. Customs. You're saying excuse me to the people in line as you walk past them to the spot that isn't really yours. Sanctions, I mentioned, can be punishments, but not always. They can be rewards, but they're inducements to do the right thing, the thing that is in harmony with what other members of your culture are doing. So laws are norms, typically mores, that have been codified. Now there are some mores, some moral principles that are maybe implied in law but aren't directly carried over. So norms may not have many sanctions, but if they've been turned into laws, yes, there could be sanctions. Quite often negative punishment of some sort. Folkways are like customs, as I said. They carry, there's few sanctions, if any, for violating those. If you don't say good morning or excuse me to someone, you're not going to be punished. You might be eventually if you are violating a custom on a regular basis in a small group of people. You might be excluded in some fashion from that group. But so etiquette and manners are some of these customs, table manners, for instance. But of course, table manners depend upon the social setting. sometimes you may find yourself in a formal dinner with multiple kinds of fork and spoon. So, and whether or not you know what fork you're supposed to use with a given dish, or course as it's called when you get several dishes in succession, finish one and another comes, that's going to that's a class marker in this society. I'll talk more about that later. The idea of cultural capital, knowing how these things, how to, you know, what fork and spoon to use in a formal dinner party, um, knowing about art and music of the high variety is part of cultural capital. It's one way members of one class recognize each other. So it's a class marker. Material culture is all the physical things: food, clothing, houses, the tools you use to do whatever you have to do to survive. They're material. They also can have symbolic meanings, so they're part of what we call symbolic. Well, how can a material thing have a symbolic meaning? Well, obviously you wear a particular kind of t-shirt that advertises a musical group or a film or sport. The fact that you're a fan of a particular team, you know, that's your shirt, but it's protecting you from the wind and elements, sunburn perhaps, but it also is conveying something about you're a fan of this team or of this band or this, you're really into this film to the extent you want to advertise the film and your membership in the group, the cult of the film. So material things can have specific, you know, meanings that members of one culture understand right away and members of another culture don't. For instance, you have a Monopoly game. You may have played this game. It was very popular from the early part of the 20th century. I know you can still buy it. It's been a long time since I've played it. It's something children often learn to play with their parents, but some people eventually take it very seriously, and then you don't want to play it anymore. So there's a little piece that you have picked that goes around the board, and there's a little dog, and there's an iron, and there is a top hat. Well, the top hat, in the era this game was developed, and for many years you would see someone in a top hat. That's part of a formal dress, and you might wear that to a wedding, but you would always wear it if you were a banker, for instance. So most of us don't have formal apparel on hand, tuxedos or whatever. We rent them when needed, because you don't need them that often. But members of the upper class need them a lot. They go to formal affairs, what are called black tie dinners, where you must dress to, you know, in a conspicuously expensive way. In Europe, in the Middle Ages, there were many countries had things called sumptuary laws, which regulated what kind of clothing you could wear if you were a member of the lower classes primarily. For instance, you could not wear clothing made of velvet. That was reserved for the upper classes. If you were doing it anyway, it might be seen as you are pretending you are above the place that you've been put in the great chain of being that I've already mentioned. There were punishments for wearing clothes that were only allowed for the upper class if you were not a member of that class. Tattoos, piercings can advertise your membership in a specific culture, and they're material. They're on your skin or hanging, you know, from they're something in your ear or your nose or your chin in the case of the Yanomami. So they're material, but they convey symbolic meaning. So here's a few things. The Amish, you may know of the Amish. They are a culture that rejects modern technology. For religious reasons, they reject modern technology. They're very devout. And I don't think there are many in Texas, but there are many living in Indiana, Pennsylvania, up in that area, Ohio probably. And they will not use cars, so they get around with a horse and a buggy like this. It's called buggy carriage, perhaps you could call it in other cases. And they will all have an orange triangle on the back too. So you can, if you're approaching at high speed one of these vehicles, you will know right away that it's a different kind of a vehicle. It's, you know, you don't want to run it down. The Amish have very strict rules for their children. All men seem to dress much the same. They all have beards after they are men and not boys, of course. Women dress very modestly, but there's an odd custom where when a child reaches a certain point, there might be like 17, 18 years old, they're allowed to go to the city and use whatever technology they want for a period of time, usually close to a summer. It's called Rumspringa, and they go wild. So they're allowed to do whatever they want. And you would think that many of them would decide just to stay and reject this very simple, uniform religious culture they grew up in, but in general, they just return and do whatever they do. Many of them are farmers, but they will also work in whatever businesses and industries might be in the area. So here we have a man in China plowing a field using a mule, I believe. Yeah, undoubtedly a mule, which, in case you don't know, a mule is a hybrid between a donkey and a horse, and they're sterile. Mules cannot make other mules. The only way to make them is a donkey and a horse. So, all right, here's are the leaders, the highest ranking folks in a village in, let's see, what does this tell me here? Well, anyway, Ghana. This is a spice shop in Iraq. I haven't seen spice shops like this in the United States. There are specialty stores that have a lot of spices, but few just devoted to spices. So this is you. If you're from that area of the world, you've probably seen this. Here's, I believe it's an Inuit member of a group of people that live in the frozen north of this hemisphere, Canada, Greenland, perhaps. Also, there are some in Northern Europe, I'm not certain, but in any case, he's building a tool of some sort. iPhone, part of material culture, right? And this fellow, if you're from South America, you might, and you zoom in on this, you might see that that's a gourd-like thing with a straw. This is mate. Mate is a tea. It's a stimulant. Caffeine is found in the plant from which it's made. So in the morning, typically, you'll put some mate in this gourd. It doesn't have to be a gourd. It often is. And then you carry a thermos of cold water, and you'll drink your mate, and then pour some more water in, and it will leach out caffeine and other flavorings and compounds, and you've got another gourd full of goodness. Okay. Symbolic culture. Symbols, gestures, or objects that have meanings associated with them that are recognized by people who share a culture. So this can be hand signals in a gang culture, for instance. That would be a subculture. The way people applaud something they like varies. Symbols, and symbols can be something you wear. It can be on your shirt. It can be a tattoo, for instance. Symbolic culture is all these parts of culture that are not, strictly speaking, physical material objects. As I say, some things straddle that, but not all. So, and all these values, norms, folkways, these cultural rules, they're part of symbolic culture. They're not physical. We learn them from other members of our culture. Our parents probably have the biggest influence on our learning of these things. But maybe the most important symbolic element in our culture is language. Language, we don't know it when we are born. Now, some, Noam Chomsky would say we have predisposition to know certain kinds of languages more rapidly than others. That is genetic and inborn, but for the most part, we have to learn how to read and write. We don't. It's easier for some of us than for others. Um, so here are some symbols. Before I go on, language. Spoken language developed long before written language. Um, Obviously, because for that reason, we have no idea when people began to speak and communicate to one another. But from a biological evolutionary standpoint, our ancestor had to develop a throat that was capable of emitting different sounds and controlling those sounds. So a larynx had to evolve. The other primates, our other primate cousins, the great apes, chimpanzees, they don't have quite as developed a larynx as we do. They make just a few very simple sounds. We make very complex sounds. So probably spoken language developed on that basis, and some other archaeological evidence that's been found between 50 and 150,000 years ago. So written language, on the other hand, is much more recent, just maybe about 6,000 years. The Sumerians are in what's now Iraq and Syria were the first to begin to develop a symbolic written language. And they had a pictogram-based language. They made symbols that stood for certain things. They stood for the entire thing. It wasn't an alphabet. They would use a reed to press these figures into a block of clay and then bake the clay, and so it would last a long time. And it was a wedge-shaped marks. The end of these reeds was kind of triangular, and the Latin word for wedge is cuneus. So this type of writing became known as cuneiform. You may have seen it. You'll see it in a second, but. That was the first sort of language. I'm getting ahead of myself, I think. Back to the symbols. Conveying symbolic meaning. You might suspect this person driving this had long hair, might use some kind of drugs, perhaps a hippie sort, you would call them, in the 70s and 60s. This is a Volkswagen bus. I had one, but I kept it beige. I was not a hippie. If you don't know what the hippies were, HIPPIE, they were a rebellious group of youth in the late 60s and early 70s who made a lot of their elders angry. They adopted a style of dressing, talking, living that was completely unlike their parents. Some of them rejected materialism. They rejected society as it was and went to live in communes where there could be something like group marriages, and then you would work the land together and share everything equally and educate your own children. Most communes failed. There were many of them, but they failed. So anyway, here we have, this is a high administrative official at the University of Cambridge in England, a very old institution, and this outfit he's wearing, this identifies his position, and also probably identifies maybe even which university he went to. In the case of faculty, it does. You can, if you attend Oxford, Cambridge, one of these elite schools that's been around since the Middle Ages, one of your main expenses is a set of clothing, rich for meetings, for these weekly communal meals that you have. You have to wear a robe when you take an exam. Now the robes are, I think they're just plain black for an undergraduate. If you're in graduate school, there's some more embellishment. So there will be formal assemblies where everyone's wearing their symbolic attire, and you can look out over a crowd of 1,000 people and know exactly the status and the pecking order of each of these people by what they're wearing. faculty that had their doctorates from Cambridge would wear something slightly different from those that had been educated elsewhere. Moving on, a little subculture of sorts, but they're certainly their dress expresses the fact that they are big fans of Star Trek. These are Trekkies. If you see this thing on a shirt or a bumper sticker, you know they're fans of the University of Texas. This is a sort of a tattoo. This means a specific thing. Mi vida loca, my crazy life. If you are a woman who's kind of an ally associated with a Latino street gang, you might be expected to get this little tattooing done. And finally, I mentioned the symbols can tell you what's the appropriate behavior in the place you're in. They can tell you where you are. And I don't know if anyone knows what this is, but this is the symbol of a local, well, they're global, but they started here, motorcycle club. They are listed as an organized criminal enterprise by the federal government because there's been a lot of evidence presented that they have been, and many people have gone to prison for activities in this Bandidos Motorcycle Club. MC stands for Motorcycle Club. This 1% thing, this comes from the days when you would see a lot of people who like to ride motorcycles forming groups and riding in groups, and some people were disturbed because there was a stereotype of motorcycle riders as being outlaws and violent and dangerous. And so someone, I don't recall who, made the statement to the media that 99% of motorcycle riders are law-abiding citizens just like you and me. Well, that leaves 1% who are not, and they proudly identify themselves as 1%ers. There are a handful of motorcycle gangs like that. Hells Angels in California is one. There are no Hells Angels chapters in Texas. The Bandidos have reacted poorly to the attempts to make one. There was a gentleman who had been rejected by the Bandidos. He was a little too off the wall for them, and he was angry, so he decided to establish a Hells Angels chapter in Texas. He was warned that no, you cannot do that. There will be consequences. This is our territory. He persisted. He did not get much interest, but he did wear the Hells Angels colors, which would be a leather vest of some sort with the patch similar to this, but Hells Angels of California, a different design. He was wearing that around Austin all the time, and after a couple of warnings, he left a restaurant with his family one afternoon and just dropped and bled out. He had been shot from a great distance by someone with a high-powered rifle and a scope. He was murdered. Now, the investigation into that murder took many years, but I don't think they ever determined who actually shot him, but they found enough evidence to convict several people of conspiracy to commit murder, among other things. The president and treasurer of the Bandidos, who lived in Conroe, by the way, just up the road, are in prison now. Several others are in prison. They would make their money by drug trafficking, human trafficking, contract assassination. So they truly were an outlaw biker gang. However, I'm just stating this as a fact. I'm not judging them. There are many socially respectable murderers out there. We've seen a few of them in the media lately. They're losing respect, but many of them have been killing others with impunity. So I'm not going to, some of you, because they were formed here over in San Leon on the Bay. If you go to Dickinson off I-45 and turn left and keep going, you'll get to San Leon. Periodically, they have reunions down there. So in any case, if you're in a place like a bar and there are a lot of guys wearing this, don't pick on them. Don't make any jokes about their patch. It would not be healthy. They're serious about their business. So, but again, I'm not, if you have a relative or are a member of the Banditos, that's fine with me. I'm taking a cultural relativist stance on here. Now, I had a student last semester or semester before last who told me in class when I was going over this that her grandmother was murdered by the Banditos. They drowned her in a pond because she caught them siphoning gas from somebody's vehicle. So it's no joke. I have had a student, though, who seen that her uncle might have been a member. So I don't want to condemn, or even though I may have an opinion and you probably do, I'm going to just make that clear. So that's enough of that. Moving on, signs. Some signs are almost universal. Some are a little harder to interpret. This one is hard to figure out. Mentioned language. It's a collective product. The language evolves, and many of us are part of this evolution, creating a phrase that a lot of people like and is picked up, or a description of a particular activity that's summarized in a phrase. I'm trying to think of a good example now of that. The internet has led to, a proliferation of new words and phrases. And wow, I'm blanking on this. When I first did this lecture, there was something in the air that I would have be able to share with you. But often the words then fall out of favor. So, a complex language allows complex communication. And when it's written down, you can store information over time. You don't have to learn things orally, be told how to do things. You can read how to do things. Of course, now you can get a YouTube video that will show you how to do most things. And that's almost a reversion to the old ways, except you can call them up at any time. It's not your father telling you how to change the oil in a car. It's some stranger on YouTube who's showing you a short video of how to do it. So you can record all these things, origin stories, moral codes. Sapir Whorf hypothesis is controversial. It's all sociology classes include this. It's the idea that your language shapes your reality. That different cultures with different languages can have different realities, and often an example would be if you live in a culture that grows many kinds of rice, you're going to you have a lot of names for rice. The Hanuno, which is language of the Mangayan people of the Philippines, they have 92 names for rice. And the Eskimos, which are the Inuits again, Eskimo is an older term, you don't hear that much, but they used to provide a number for how many different types of snow they knew. The number was wrong, but they do know have different words for different types of snow. We, of course, here in this area don't. But they live in a world where knowing whether or not what you're seeing is a solid bank of snow and not a little bit of snow over a barely frozen river is vital to staying alive. So I really just know that there's snow that's good for making snowballs and there's snow that isn't, or snowmen. All right, linguistic relativity, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But there's evidence that this has been way overblown. Ideal and real culture. Ideal culture, that involves the values, how members of the culture think something should be. Real culture is how things actually are. So an American ideal is meritocracy, hard work, and if you work hard and you're talented and you can rise through the social stratification system, you can achieve social mobility. and move up in the world, so to speak. Equality under the law is another ideal or value, which is violated often. So in terms of the reality, a lot of people get where they got because they inherited their money, or they move up, they have social mobility because they know the right people. And then we have institutional racism rather than equality under the law. So ideal versus real culture. I mentioned ideology early on, set of ideas that makes the way things are seem natural and normal and the only way things could be. Here's a little bit more information about that. Cultural products are important vehicles for reflecting and reproducing the dominant ideology in the culture. Well, what is the dominant ideology? Just it's the one most people accept and use to understand the world on a day-to-day basis. And here's a little more detail about that. So if you read this, don't get the idea that simply because this is there, that there's no payoff from being talented and working hard if you are not a member of the middle to upper classes, because there is. It's just that some people don't have to work as hard to become economically successful. Subcultures, I already mentioned, groups that share a specific identification apart from society's majority. I don't remember what that last part of the sentence means. I think that was an unfinished sentence. Subcultures can be based on a lot of things: lifestyles, interests, the motorcycles I mentioned, your beliefs, your hobbies, fashion statements, what you wear, a private language and slang that you may know and use. Some of the Trekkies learned Klingon, but that they were still Trekkies. Klingon is, of course, an imaginary language. People who were into Lord of the Rings used to learn an imaginary language that the elves spoke. I did not. So, but anyway, there's something that distinguishes them from other groups. They share, and I think that's what should have been here, the members share most of the dominant values and norms, follow most of the norms of the dominant society. So I will fix that and put the correction in Canvas. Some examples, I've given you several examples. The LGBT community, they're a subculture of sorts, but they share most of the same values as everyone else. They are set apart and different because of the unique feature that they are not they're not the norm. There's a term called heteronormativity, where the norm is you must be heterosexual. That's one norm that they don't necessarily observe. You don't share all the norms of the dominant culture, just most of them. Religious subcultures like the Amish I mentioned. Their religion is one of the Christian religions, and yet they reject technology, and so that sets them apart. You know, they dress in a way that you can see them. Same goes for Hasidic Jews. They dress a particular way, very. FLDS, I haven't heard much about them lately. This is the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints Church who practice polygamy. That was a common practice early on in the Latter-day Saints Church, otherwise known as Mormons. It had to be abandoned in order for Utah to be admitted as a state. It had to be formally abandoned in the Constitution of Utah. But some legislators in Utah are in favor of allowing it once again. But the FLDS never gave it up. And if you want to see what that is like, look for an HBO series, if you have Amazon Prime and HBO, called Big Love. It's about some fundamentalist Mormons and their life in Salt Lake City. hiding their true beliefs from other Mormons. So other bikers, I mentioned Shriners. You don't know what those are. I'll show you a photo. Goths, a particular way of dressing. Steampunks, I think they're no longer around so much. They were when I wrote this. Many a lot of sociological research has focused on subcultures and ended up in the creation of an ethnography that was published as a book. Like we talked about Gang Leader for a Day, Sidewalk, also Laud Humphreys, The Tea Room Trade. These are some others, just an example. Here are the Shriners. You may have heard of the Shriners Burn Hospital in Galveston. This is the group that raises money for that. They do this in parades on particularly on patriotic holidays or whatever. They drive these little cars and wear these hats. They have a quasi-Arabic ritualistic secret code of some sort. You have to be invited to be a member. You don't just go and join. And there's some rituals they don't share with others that are, I'm sure, quite harmless, knowing who some of the Shriners were in my hometown. But you know, but these folks are bikers. They're into motorcycles. They're not necessarily an outlaw 1%er gang. There's a big rally in Sturgis, South Dakota. That's where this photo was taken. Tens of thousands of people on motorcycles go up there and spend a few days together. So, oops, sorry. This is the subject of one of the discussions. I'll save that for later. If you're interested in the polygamists and what they established a compound in Texas. They had one in Arizona. I think it was in Texas that their leader, Warren Jeffs, was accused and convicted of statutory rape. I think it's called that in Texas, meaning having sexual relations with someone under the age of 14, I believe it is in Texas, because they have multiple brides and the old men like to get young new brides quite often. So it violated state laws, their religious practices. Your religious practices are generally not allowed if they violate state laws. There are some exceptions. The only one I know of, though, is the Native American church that's allowed to use the peyote, the buttons, the fruit of the peyote cactus, which contains a hallucinogenic drug. They're able to use that in their rituals that they've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years. A friend of mine in Dallas who was a Comanche told me they still use peyote when a child is born, and the males of the group will go into a sweat lodge and take peyote and come up with a name for the child that has just been born. So they're allowed to do that, even though non-members of the church would be committing a felony by possessing it. So rockabilly is another subculture. If you want to see that, you'd have to really know which band to look for. But if they're anywhere, they're at the Continental Club down at 3800 South Main in Houston. Rockabilly is a musical style that it was originally kind of a mix of country, western, and rock and roll. Elvis Presley started in rockabilly. Johnny Cash, you may have heard of, also started in that. And it came out of the 1950s. So if you're really into it, you're going to dress like it's 1951. This is drive an old car. Here's a guy, boots rolled up, probably got pomade in his hair. Now I have pomade, but I haven't had a haircut in quite a while, so I needed to keep the hair out of my eyes. But a rockabilly person would use pomade to make a big ducktail thing. There you go. That's a pomaded hair. That's the style. Tattoos, poodle skirts. There's a rockabilly nuclear family. Look at that TV. How retro. I don't know what's rockabilly about him. maybe the poodle, but it is mid-century 1950s furniture. So children, I had some of this stuff, cowboy clothes, and again, poodle skirt, and that Formica table. Yes, this is the 50s. The child, the radios, but there's the DVDs, it looks like. Yeah, now here, Marlon Brando, look. And the bad girl. And the old car. It's very big in Japan still. Google Japanese rockabilly and you will see some really extreme hairdos. And video, I don't have time for that, but let us go back to our slideshow. Countercultures, they reject a lot of the dominant values of a culture. The hippies I mentioned, that was a counterculture. That's really when the term began to be common. They set themselves apart totally from the dominant culture in an ideological cocoon. The world that they're in doesn't really overlap the world that the dominant culture is in. Rainbow people, I don't know if they're still out there. They were sort of the remnants of the hippies. They would just hitchhike around and go to various rainbow gatherings around the country. I've met some once hitchhiking back in the days when I would pick up hitchhikers if they looked harmless. It could be there are hacker collectives which qualify. Hackers are into, mischief online, often stealing money or bringing down the website of a corporation they don't like or a bank. That connects to the culture jamming movement I'll get to. Here's a news story about the death of a man who I once heard speak, who has established a commune that is still running. They made the transition to making things for sale on the market. And I'm going to have to open it because I forgot his name.
The most famous hippie commune in America has lost its founding father, Stephen Gaskin, who led a caravan of psychedelic buses to a promised land in Summertown, died today at the age of 79. Gaskin had been out of the public eye with vision and health problems for some years, but there was a time when he was making regular and radical headlines in Tennessee and across the nation.
Here you have hippies.
It was a mind-blowing idea in 1971. A place with no money, no guns, like-minded, long-haired people with an intention to live an organic life. No question, Stephen Gaskin was the leader on the farm, but everyone pitched in.
We work the same as everybody does. We're not one of the outfits that go out and catch you in the airport and try to give you a paper flower and get $10 from that.
8 years into the experiment, the farm had branched out into printing, construction, solar power, and was breaking even. Locals had accepted them, even if others still questioned their beliefs. Stephen Gaskin could gather a crowd, but said he preached nothing different.
Basic mainstream religious theory is reflected in all of the major world religions over the last few thousand years.
If the farm had a notorious moment, it was the 1974 raid by authorities bent on finding marijuana. Gaskin said he didn't grow the plants they...
Okay, I'm going to stop there. This is pretty bad video, but Stephen Gaskin. I went to hear him speak in Kansas City in a park. Listen to him. I don't want to say propagandize. He was advertising the farm and inviting people to come if they had the right mindset. Burning Man has been called a counterculture. If you don't know what Burning Man is, you can Google it. I'm not going to go into that. It's an annual event in the Nevada desert on a playa lake, a dry lake bed. And it is so barren there, insects, bugs cannot survive. So if you want to go spend some time outside with no bugs, that would be the place. So, oh yes, there's a little more about Burning It Man, what's been going on. It is evolving. The Silicon Valley billionaires have been kind of co-opting a lot of it, claiming that they are the best example of the Burning Man ethos. Multiculturalism is a term you may hear. Celebration of diversity, acceptance of all cultures. Assimilation is something which almost used to be expected. In some cultures, it might still be expected of people who are immigrants, for instance. Another cultural group is expected to learn, or does decide to learn, they just adopt the values, way of clothing, language of the group they're joining. Sometimes it's been forced, for instance, with the first inhabitants of this hemisphere, often called Native Americans. First peoples is a better term because they came from Asia. Okay, Native American children were taken from their parents and put in kind of boarding schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they would be beaten if they spoke their native language. So you can watch this little video if you like. It's a old man talking about his childhood and living at this boarding school and experiences he had and things he saw. Cultural relativism, I use that term. It's the idea that each culture must be understood on its own terms. Okay. Some of these, ethnocentrism is the belief your own culture is the best. It's superior. We hear this from some of our leaders, at least it's implied, but definitely we hear this a lot from one of our leaders in particular. Xenophobia, fear of the other, those who are different. I need to take this out because I put that in when he was just running for the presidency. I had no idea he would actually be elected. And someday this could come back to haunt me. It hasn't yet, so maybe I'll skate by without it. And I can put it in past tense because he still does this. That's part of his playbook, really. Nationalism is a term which you might hear. It's devotion to your own country no matter what. The nation. The nation is a new thing. It's not something natural, organic that springs from the soil. There were those who thought it did. For instance, certain Germans, Adolf Hitler was one, but others, a few philosophers thought there was something uniquely German about the people that lived in that area. But nationalism is it's definitely a form of can be a form of xenophobia. It's beyond patriotism. It is nationalism has been spreading in European political culture, and it's opposed to internationalism, where nations work together to solve problems and share resources to a certain extent. Nationalism goes the other direction. Separate nations, separate rules, separate economies, all these things. So the nation, the country, so is what Benedict Anderson called it, an imagined community. In the book of the same name, Imagined Communities, almost the same name, plural. It's something which was constructed, and part of that construction involves developing a popular press, having people that are reading newspapers in the same language. So having a common language is important. A common religion is a factor. Makes it easier to create a nation if you're just focusing on people who have the same basic values and moral code and beliefs about the next world and so forth. Imagine Communities. It's an interesting book. So Germany, for instance, there was no Germany before 1871. It was unified by a man named Bismarck shortly after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. After defeating the French, the Germans were very proud of themselves. They bonded in a big way, but they were forced to bond by Bismarck. And where Germany had been a collection of what we call Germany, were a number of independent states, many of which were controlled by princes or by dukes or earls. There were, I've forgotten the number, there were many of them before Napoleon in the early 1800s went through the area with his army and took over that area, and he condensed them down into a manageable 13, I think, something along those lines. You had Bavaria, you had Prussia, several others. Hesse von Holstein was one. They were all independent states, but they were joined together, shared, and their culture became a little more uniform. Bavarians still look different from the rest of Germans in some ways. They have some cultural practices that are different and some unique sorts of clothing that they've retained. That's why I said they look different. I didn't mean physically different. Schleswig-Holstein was one of the other states. Queen Elizabeth in England, it came from a German family, and I don't recall the principality that her people came from, but it was one of these small states. So nations are created, they're not natural. High and low culture I mentioned earlier. So going to the opera, driving a Rolls Royce is you're showing your upper class. High culture is for you. Low culture includes popular culture. Usually refers to cultural practices or preferences of lower classes. And the dominant elites think it's less valuable aesthetically. It's less real. There's less artistic aura in the paintings that the lower class like. Pierre Bourdieu wrote a book, Distinction, and that book showed how these tastes in art and music are class markers, and they can have an effect on where you end up occupationally. Because if you know something about a piece of art that is on your boss's wall and it's some abstract art, which traditionally, Bourdieu pointed out, the French lower classes did not like that stuff. Picasso. Picasso is who's coming to mind, but Leger, Jackson Pollock, abstract expressionism, Ludwig Kirchner. I don't know. Anyway, they preferred like something, a still life, something that was looked in the painting like it would in real life, or a photograph of a landscape of a mountain scene. That's what you tended to see in lower class households. One reason for that is that to understand abstract art and see it as something more than just scribbles or random splatters of paint, you needed to learn how to see it, to appreciate it. You had to visit a lot of museums as a child. It means you had to have parents that could afford to take you to a museum and had the time to take you to a museum and explain these things to you. You had books about these things around the house. Your parents liked them, and they were, again, class markers. So and even knowing about ballet. So ballet lessons are expensive. Ballroom dance lessons are expensive. These things that you learn how to do, which may suggest at least that you know how to be higher class. You know how to be one of the elites, one of the, I don't want to say rulers, but I will, one of the ruling class. And if you're applying for a job somewhere and the person interviewing you and making the decision is one of these elites, if you can indicate that you know about the culture that the elites like, that's going to give you a leg up. I mentioned in last lecture the German Jewish Marxist refugees from Nazi Germany that came to the United States and wrote a number of books that were very influential. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno introduced in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment the idea of a culture industry. They wrote, and this is more Adorno's influence than Horkheimer's, that culture under capitalism had become a business, that things were produced not because they had some aesthetic or artistic value, but because they would sell, and they were mass produced. And their function, and he included films, the cinema, movies, music, their function was to pacify the lower classes so that they would accept their domination by the bourgeoisie, by the capitalist class. So it was to suppress any revolutionary impulse that might be stirring in the proletarian mind. So, and really, you know, this idea, although they were elitists themselves in the fact that they denounced a lot of popular music and cinema and so forth, they thought there could be no critical moment, no possibility of resistance could be, the notion that something should be resisted, in their view, could not be expressed through films or music. And we know that that is not true now. It took maybe the 1960s, the close connection between rock and roll music and the anti-war movement and the hippie commune movement to, you know, get past that idea that only a certain type of high cultural product had what was called a critical moment, in their words, that advanced a implicit and immediately understood criticism of the dominance culture of capitalism. So anyway, where you find a lot of Marxists still active is in the area of decoding the messages that are provided us in cultural products, because they still are. I mean, it's not simply because they were wrong about popular music and films doesn't mean we're not absorbing ideological beliefs through films and music. We certainly are. And many Marxists in film studies and literary studies and cultural studies is an entire field almost devoted to looking for this hidden ideological claims that are smuggled into our thinking. Popular culture is a more charitable term for what we were calling low culture. But David Grazian has done a lot of work on popular culture. He says it can be understood, it's the culture of the people, popular. It can be understood in four ways. It's something that just has a lot of commercial success. So Taylor Swift's music, Jurassic Park films, the World Cup, Kanye West, can be just things that are cultural that people can understand. Brands, or for a while, Paris Hilton, you may not know who she is, that's just as well. Kardashians are still around. And there were commercials in these logos, these brands. People around the world might recognize most of these now. McDonald's, Volkswagen, Starbucks, New York Yankees. It also can it can be mass produced, this tacky cultural objects. This is definitely Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry at work here. Appealing to our least attractive impulses, what Grazian called the lowest common denominator. A lot of reality TVs like that. Naked and Afraid is bizarre. Dating Naked was something that I don't think they is around anymore. It might be syndicated, but just, you know, strange stuff. Why people would want to be on such reality shows, I don't know. But you can refer to it as televised ritual humiliation. Jerry Springer show still in syndication. He's the king of that. People did go on his show and just really behave in ways that they were probably embarrassed about later, but I think there was some money in it. Jersey Shore, you can look at this if you like. Boy bands, New Kids on the Block, this is 1990. It's the total antithesis of what he considers the real popular culture, which is produced by, belongs to the people, not by big corporations. You don't go on tour if you're a musician with truckloads of equipment and a giant light show. You may be just a person singing, you're sitting with a guitar in a small club. Roots music is one word, one genre which includes a lot of this. Includes African American work songs, spirituals, world music. Take a look at these. These are examples of what Grazian would consider popular culture. I mentioned culture is globalized now. We import a lot of cultural products from other nations. There used to be a lot of fear of Americanization, sometimes called Coca-colonization, after Coca-Cola. Coca-colonization sounds a little differently. So Americanization is where a culture is able to dominate another one, assigning a high value to their culture so you can sell more of your own products. There was fear it would, and it has happened sometimes, crowded out, eliminated the local competition. The American film industry is still dominant. I need to update this, obviously. I don't think it's changed much. Now, we saw Parasite win an Oscar and some films from Mexico that were highly regarded. I'm not sure how they did at the box office, but definitely the critics and the awards market showed some diversification in American film. Parasite from South Korea may have been the turning point, because it was, at least many critics think it will be. We will see. American films accounted for 63% of global ticket sales in 2013, so it had increased in that period. Cultural imperialism is the prototype, the paradigm for this notion of Americanization. A more powerful culture dominates a weaker one culturally. So Starbuckization, this is something Ritzer, who wrote a lot about the McDonaldization of society. Here he talks about Starbuckization. Starbucks has definitely expanded and gone global. I still have around here a card I got from Starbucks when I was stranded in looking for a job in Seattle in 1996, yes, or 7. They were just starting up. I also applied with Amazon when they were just looking for programmers to allegedly work for a company that had a new model for distributing books. That's all they were going to be about. I lost my little thank you, we'll get in touch if we like you thing, but I still have the one from Starbucks. So evidence I was there at the time. So if I had gotten hired in Starbucks earlier, Amazon, and well, I would have been fired from Amazon, but I might have walked away with some valuable stock. Globalization, as I mentioned, is not one way. We may be exporting films, but we are importing a lot. Not just food is one. There's 50 years ago in most parts of the country, you would be lucky to find Mexican food, much less Thai food, African food, Afghani food, Middle Eastern food, Greek food. I mean, we have all this and so much more in this area because we are one of the most diverse areas in the United States. It's claimed, I'm not sure it's correct, that there may be more languages, unique languages spoken in the Houston area than in New York. A sociologist at Rice claims we are the most culturally diverse area in the United States. A lot of that diversity is in one county, in Fort Bend County. That's so without Fort Bend, we would probably, they are definitely what took us into the big leagues, I think. Western Buddhism, mindfulness meditation. This is something imported from the East. The mindfulness teachers who teach mindfulness in schools and corporations, they're using an imported Buddhist meditation practice, and they're often motivated by the dream of spreading Buddhist beliefs, but they tone that down in order to get buy-in from corporations. We are not only, we saw how much our economy is dependent upon consumption, a consumer-driven economy. We saw that by looking at the unemployment rate when we had to start staying in our homes for a while. How many people lost their jobs? How many businesses have closed and may not be back that are restaurants, bars, movie theaters, all these things which were providing things for our consumption. As I mentioned, Leslie Sklar talks about the culture ideology of consumption as an export from the Western world to the developing world. The idea that the point of life is having as much stuff as possible. If you're not able to consume a lot of stuff, to have Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Hulu, and whatever streaming service, you can't have it all, then there's something lacking. You need to do something to get it. There's also a trend towards ethical consumerism, paying more attention to the source, the provenance of your clothing, your food, are things produced sustainably? Are they produced by a company that treats its workers well? Organic food, the organic food revolution is part of this. So there's some opposition, organized opposition to commercial culture. There's a magazine published, I used to get it. It's expensive, it's pretty to look at, called Adbusters. They're sort of the focus around which these culture jammers organize. Culture jammers are people who kind of subvert corporate or consumer messages and repurpose them, change it so it's an anti-consumption message. One thing they've been known to do is go to a shopping mall around Christmas and set up a table and assign free credit counseling. And if you go for the counseling, they will they will advise you to cut up your credit cards and give you some scissors. The stores in the malls don't want that at Christmas. They've been known to go to Walmart's on Black Friday, that big shopping day, and take all of the little carts that are there for people who are differently abled, may have trouble walking or something. They take all those and they just start driving around Walmart's until they're all caught and kicked out. They sponsor something called Buy Nothing Day. I'm not sure this link is active, but let's see. No, that is the alternative to Black Friday. The same day as Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving, people are usually off work and the stores will have crazy bargains. People line up at the malls and Target and Best Buy and whatever it is, overnight to get in there, and you see the scenes of people just literally walking all over each other to get to something that's on sale. It's pretty sad. But they advertise and promote Buy Nothing Day. Don't buy a single thing on that day. That, our culture is telling us the American thing, the normal thing to do is go shopping on that day all day long. So this was a long lecture. I should have broken it into 2 parts, and it's really long considering you just have an open book quiz to deal with this, but you'll find all the answers in the PDF that's already there. However, I'm going to try to record lectures for all of these things. So anyway, this say something about the, I don't want to say something about the exam. I may reuse this recording. Okay. I'm going to stop the share, and I hope oh, thank God. Yeah. Sometimes I talk for an hour and I haven't been recording. But in this case, I have been. So thank you for your time.